This afternoon we're going to talk about dial indicating the clutch hub on the engine, also known as measuring the runout. And the idea here is you want to have as little runout as possible on your clutch hub as this part of the assembly is spinning at crankshaft speed, approximately 16 to 19,000 RPM, depending on what sort of head speed you're running. And any sort of off-center on this will impart vibration to the rest of the craft. We measure this in thousandths of an inch. We use a dial indicator back here to read this measurement. Acceptable ranges somewhere between 0 and say maybe 2 or 3 thousandths. If you're getting values upwards of 4 to 5 thousandths, you will notice frothing in your fuel tank. Get much above that, you can impart enough vibration to the airframe to cause loose nuts and bolts, excessive chafing on where harnesses are attached to the frame. Other early signs of wear will happen. So let's go over what we got laid out here. First, we're going to need an engine that's not mounted yet. We're going to need an engine crank locking tool. Excuse me. In this case, a 2.5 millimeter driver. This particular engine nut setup, we're going to use a 10 millimeter deep well socket. Green Loctite. This would be Loctite 290 or Permatex 29000. It's a wicking type. This is a M3 tap, 5/16 nut runner, aka 8 millimeter for removing the glow plug. Your clutch stack, in this case from the Pantera 50. The dial indicator. A balancer, which you're going to what's the balancer for? We'll get there. Also a drill, and then ultimately we'll show the vise. Okay, so run out when we talk in these very minute numbers of 1/1000ths of an inch up to maybe 3/1000ths of an inch. Very small, hard to see. Let me show you a good, bad example of run out. So what I've done is I've taken a clutch hub and I've mounted onto a cordless drill. I've got my dial indicator laid out here on a nice carpet, so it will have some friction to it. Basically on this gauge, we're at a little over 70 thousandths here, 60, 50, 40, 30. So I've got this bias to swing across the bottom side. So I'm going to go ahead and slowly rotate this. So if we see, we're going 60 thousandths to a little over 80. So that delta, that swing that part is going through right now is about 20 thousandths, a little over 20 thousandths of an inch. If you were to sit in that helicopter for more than 30 seconds at full RPM, you probably wouldn't have any teeth left. Thank God it's a model, right? Alright, so now we're going to get a little further onto this. Okay, so in preparation for us doing the dial indication on this, we need a couple things to the motor first. Number one, we're going to need to rotate the engine. So we're going to remove the glow plug, set that aside. Next thing, we're going to remove the back plate so we can use the crank locking tool. Little side note on that. The engine I'm using right now is actually an airplane engine, if you noticed. And it's a 46 FX. It happens to be the same crankcase size as an OS 50 Hyper. This tool also works on it. Excuse me, still getting over my cold. If you are using the new Hyper 55, this is the OS crank locking tool that has been shipped out and known and loved by many. When you insert this into the Hyper 55, the Hyper 55 piston has a little bit longer skirt that hangs down, and you will run into it. And it's hard to see in this light, but what I've done here, if you follow the lines that the tool is outlining here, I've cut a beveled angle on this thing so it no longer bumps the skirt. So if you use the standard stock OS crank locking tool on a Hyper 50 or non-Hyper 50 or the other engines works fine, but if it was the new Hyper 55, be careful of the piston skirt. You need to modify the tool so it doesn't damage the skirt. Okay, so I've got my back plate off, and you'll notice the engine's at top dead center. We're going to rotate this around. Bottom dead center. Then our crank locking tool goes in like so. And basically what that does is that prevents it from going up and down. One thing you don't want to do for a crank locking tool, you don't insert something into the side of it and shove it through the ports. Good way to damage the piston. You also don't want to use these ones that go in through the glow plug and apply pressure to the top of the piston. Good way to crack your piston, and you'll be pulling an engine out sooner than you want. So buy the appropriate tool, do it right. So I've done that to prep the engine. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and put the motor mount. That gives us a little more meat to hold on to. You can see I've got the other parts, the collet, the tapered nut, engine mounting bolts. I've got my fan and clutch assembly. I've also got my clutch bolts here. We'll come back and revisit that here in just a moment. One thing that I'd like to do on all my models is, if I'm going to be tapping things, is you never know what the machine's like. So this already has an M3 tap. I'll go ahead and run this through all of the bolt holes that I'll be using on this mount. I do the same thing on the airframe. It just makes life a lot less frustrating if you got a nice clean threaded insert to put your bolt into. Another point in using a tap on these, you'll notice I've got a lot of swarf hanging out around here, so we'll clean it off. But if this engine mount has been in use and we've used Loctite on it, and let's say this engine's been in and out of the helicopter, say a half a dozen times over the service life of this season, it's nice to come back in, run that tap back through there, because as you add more and more thread locker, it tends to build up, and these holes get tighter and tighter and tighter until eventually you snap something off, and then you're stuck with that trouble. So just a point, after multiple disassembly and reassemblies, run the tap back through, clear out all the old thread locker.